we saw what Trump tried to do in 2020. He tried to get the army to seize the voting machines in the swing states so that he could just refuse to count the votes coming out of blue districts. He just 2 weeks ago said he should have been allowed to do that, which means that he's obviously thinking about doing that again. You had the fake electors. Of course, that won't be repeated this time because it's not a presidential election, but you had an attempt at genuine election fraud. And then, of course, January 6th. So, this is a guy who has tried to overturn an election by multiple means, every single one of those means criminal, and got away with it. He didn't succeed, but he got away with it. And, and has made it very clear he's going to try it again. Meanwhile, you've got the analysis that Greg Palast done. I don't know if you've talked to him on your program, Mark.
Oh, yeah, many times.
Greg is an old statistician guy. I mean, he's got 2 degrees, one in statistics and one in journalism. He used to be a Milton Friedman student at the University of Chicago.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's fine.
Yeah. And he was, he's been hired as an economist by multiple countries over the years before he started as a reporter with BBC. So he took the statistics from the federal government. This isn't like, from some True the Vote group or something. These are the federal government and state government statistics of who voted and who was not allowed to vote and why. And what he found was that in the 2024 election, 4.2 million Americans who were legitimately on the voter rolls, legitimate citizens, should have had every right to vote. About 3 million of them were purged off the voting rolls because in 2018, the Supreme Court in the Husted v. U.S. case, John Husted was the Secretary of State of Ohio, and he was mailing postcards into black neighborhoods in Cincinnati and Cleveland and Columbus with that looked like junk mail. And then down at the bottom said, if you fail to return this, we will delete you from the voting rolls. We'll assume you've moved. And, in the Supreme Court case, in the dissent, I think it was John Paul Stevens pointed out that in a typical year, 4% of people move. And yet in that year that Husted did that, over 10% of all the voters in Ohio were removed from the voting rolls. And they were almost all people of color, in big cities. And that's how the Republican Party hangs on to power in Ohio. Well, that went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, okay, this used to be illegal. We called it caging. The Republican Party was operating under a court order not to do it from the 70s forward. But we're going to just throw all that out, and we're just going to let Husted continue doing this. So ever since then, and that was 7 years ago. Ever since then, 8 years ago. Ever since then, this is the go-to strategy that Republicans are using. So 3 million people were simply thrown off the voting rolls. Another 1.5 million people showed up to vote or mailed in a ballot. And with the mail-in ballots, about 500,000 of them, you had Republican vote viewers, watchers, whatever you call them, poll watchers, who said that signature doesn't look like it matches. I'm calling that, which meant that in most states, those people would be given 2 weeks to come in and cure their signature, right? Show up in person and present their ID. But in a lot of the red states, you don't even know that you've been challenged. So those votes weren't counted. And then another 1 million people, 1.5 million people were given provisional ballots, which again, they think that they're casting a real ballot. Provisional ballots in most cases are never counted. And again, this is because somebody challenged their right to vote. In Georgia, there's a law that allows unlimited challenges. One woman challenged 35,000 voters. She just basically pulled a list of, ACLU members or something, said none of these people, and they all got knocked off. They all got provisional ballots. Greg Palast found, just using the real authentic government numbers, you don't need any wild conspiracy theory or voting machines for this, that had those 4.2 million people been allowed to vote, from what we know about who they were and where they were, Kamala Harris would have easily won the White House, a substantial victory, and both the House and the Senate would be in the hands of Democrats right now. So, they've got a system that has been working for them for years. This is what Jeb Bush did in 2000. George, his brother, Jeb was the governor of Florida. George, his brother, was the governor of Texas. And they both knew that there was a very good chance that George W. Bush would lose in Florida. And if he lost in Florida, he lost the White House. And so what did Jeb do? He ordered Katherine Harris to take a mailing list or a list of people who were in the prisons in Texas and compare that list, only first and last names, not middle names, not birthdays. Compare that list to the Florida voter rolls. Now, the people in Texas, by and large, in prison, are by and large black or Hispanic, the vast majority of them. Black people draw from a relatively small universe of names. A lot of them are named after former presidents, for example. People named Washington and Jackson. It's just huge, the number of black people. And Hispanic people all derive their names from Spanish surnames. So you've got this very little tiny slice of names, of last names, that were the last names of the people in the prisons in Texas. You compare that to the Florida voter rolls, you're going to find a lot of those same people. You're going to find a lot of Jose Gonzalez's in the prisons in Texas and on the voting rolls in Florida. And so she knocked 90,000, mostly African-American and secondarily Hispanic people off the voting rolls in Florida months before the election, which allowed George W. Bush to win by 537 votes. They have been doing this for decades. That was in 2000. They've been doing this for decades. And I think this time, instead of 4.2 million people being knocked off the voting rolls or having their voter registration or their ability to vote challenged, I think it's going to be more like 10 million. So the question in my mind is, can we have a large enough turnout to overcome this massive voter suppression that, and not only can I predict that they're doing, but they're actually doing right now, right?
Sure, unapologetically. I mean, Pallas details it, as you say, in so many different ways. In his film, you meet the lady who kicked 30,000 people off the rolls, and I think in Georgia.
Yep.
But you're detailing something they've taken to a high art, and so. And it's sad that the only way to defeat it is kind of, to use Trump's expression, too big to rig type thing. You just want some, a tsunami of voter turnout. But I just hope that tsunami is big enough, Thom Hartmann.
I agree. And what I don't get is why the Democrats have not been screaming about this, squealing about this. This really started in a big way in the 1960s. When a guy named William Rehnquist was a local politician or a local politico down in Phoenix, and he started this thing called Operation Eagle Eye, where he was a big bear of a man, 6'4", and a lawyer, of course. He ended up Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and he would stand outside polling places. Now, this was before there were any ID laws at all, but you could still challenge people. He would stand outside polling places and challenge every black person, every Hispanic person, and every Native American, challenge their right to vote. And most of them he would intimidate to the point where they'd leave. And Operation Eagle Eye turned into the caging operation that Karl Rove was running for George W. Bush and actually for the Reagan campaign back in the 80s. That's when they got hit with the restraining order. Sorry, I've got a cat walking around here knocking my office. It's just this. I don't understand why every Democrat in America does not understand this.
But let me ask you, Thom, you understand so much. You must understand why Democrats. I think it's so outrageous. It was suggested that the last election should have been challenged by Democrats. They could have cobbled together the money necessary to challenge and recount in certain states. Why do the Democrats go so quietly?
I don't know.
You don't know, really?
I don't understand it. I've spoken to, a few of them, a couple of them on the air, about why don't you guys talk about this more? And we want people to have faith in our electoral system, and we don't want to sound like Donald Trump, and we don't want to sound like sore losers. And, I just consider that all BS, frankly. But that's their story.
It feels as though the Biden effort to maintain public institutions and faith in public institutions, it's consistent with sort of an old world view of things. But as you say, you can even go back to the old world. For decades, they have been doing this. So it's enormously disheartening that our voice in Washington, if you voted for Democrats or if you voted against Republicans and if you voted for progressive values to be reflected in public policy in any way, that's not being defended and represented in a more sturdy way. It really leaves me depressed, honestly.
Yeah. Well, it's like, today the Democrats came out and said, we want 5 changes made if we're going to allow funding for ICE. And I'm like, 5 changes? What are you talking about? Disband the organization, burn it down, start over again. This is a corrupt institution with a corrupt corporate culture, and when you get a corporate, this is why we have the corporate death penalty. It's why corporations are dissolved. The corporate culture, Enron, the corporate culture has become so poisonous, so toxic, so criminal that you can't redeem the organization. You just tear it down and start over. Of course we need enforcement of our immigration laws, but we've been doing that for what, since 1924 was when we first passed immigration laws that empowered federal authorities to move people out of the country.
Sure. I mean, and they take on different, INS or whatever. So ICE is gone, and now it'll be something else. But as you say, it can be completely reconstituted as something else with,
and it can be done right. I have a niece in northern Michigan who fell in love with a guy who owned a local Mexican restaurant, and she's as white as you can be, and he was Hispanic, and they got married. And, had a kid, and everything was wonderful until ICE showed up one day and said, now this was back during the Obama administration. ICE showed up one day and said, he's not here legally. He had come across the border. But they were very nice. I mean, they showed up in windbreakers, right, and suits. And they said, we're going to give you 30 days to get your things together. And, you've got to get out of the country, and, we'll help facilitate. She and he moved to Mexico. They've been living there since the Obama administration.
That's a wild story.
I got Bernie Sanders involved. He called up ICE, to try to, can you find an exception for this? No, sorry, he's here illegally. He's got to go. But nobody's windows got smashed. Nobody got pepper sprayed. Nobody got shot in the back. Nobody got screamed at or yelled obscenities. Nobody got thrown in a detention center. I mean, it's like, you don't have to do that. This is performance art. This is fascist performance that's going on right now.
And so in my last couple of minutes with you, let's look at that jetliner view of this rise of a fascistic regime, of dictatorial powers that are not being challenged. Tell me, as we hear comparisons to other dark leaders from World War II history, Hitler, et cetera, I'm reminded that many of these figures rose to power with tremendous popularity for a time. One thing Trump doesn't have is tremendous popularity. I'm wondering if you can assess Trump's power in that framework, because you're so good on this history, Thom. I'd like your take on this.
This is what makes him so dangerous. It's, I remember years ago when we lived in Vermont, there was a mouse in our house, and I cornered him with a laundry basket that I was going to catch him with. And that mouse reared right up on her hind legs and was going to take me out. When animals are cornered, they're the most dangerous. And that's where Trump is at right now. He's cornered. He's losing his power. He's, as you point out, lost much of his popularity. He still has extraordinary power. He still controls the levers of the executive branch, which is pretty much all of our government. And he's still got, a compliant Congress and 6 toadies on the U.S. Supreme Court. But I think this is probably the most dangerous moment for America. And, I think that this lesson, per our conversation a little earlier, this lesson that they just learned from killing 2 people in Minneapolis is that, yeah, you can have your fascism. You can convert your nation from democracy to fascism, no problem. You just have to do it quietly, carefully, methodically. You don't do it with these big, brash, bold measures that make the MAGA base so happy. It might make you popular with a small number of people, but the goal here is to end democracy in America, and they're still working on that.